down the rabbit hole, QAnon, conspiracies, and a new threat. And this definitely is important because, as we know, what can we get right in the next 10 years? That's what we want to really discuss here. So what can we get right from what has previously happened? We have a fascinating panel, and our moderator for this panel is Zoe Tabary, who is from Thomson Reuters Foundation. So please, just really pay attention, hashtag COGX 2021, and put your questions in the chat where you are. Hi, Zoe.
Thanks very much, Suki. Thanks, and hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're based. Very warm welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining this COGX panel. We're delighted to have you with us. I'm Zoe Tabary. I'm the tech editor and acting editor-in-chief at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is the charitable arm of Thomson Reuters, and I'm delighted to be hosting today. Today, we're going to be discussing the growing threat posed by conspiracy theories, the most famous of which is, of course, QAnon. And conspiracy theories, having very much started on the fringes of society, are now, from Capitol riots to vaccine boycotting, becoming a mainstream threat with real consequences. Just this week, the FBI was warning that followers of the QAnon conspiracy theory could again engage in violence against political opponents out of frustration that the theory's predictions haven't come true. On this panel today, we're going to investigate how these networks grow and what we can do to mitigate the damage. I'm joined by a terrific bunch of experts. Mike Wendling, who's presenting the award-winning BBC World Service program Trending, and is an editor with the BBC team investigating disinformation and conspiracy theories. He regularly reports on BBC outlets and has won a number of awards, most recently from the Press Gazette and the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. And he is the author of Alt-Right, From 4chan to the White House. We're also joined by Aoife Gallagher, who's an analyst on ISD's Digital Analysis Unit, which focuses on the intersection between far-right extremism, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, and using a mixture of data analysis, open source intelligence, and investigative techniques to understand the online ecosystem where these ideas flourish and spread. And previously, Aoife was a journalist with the online news agency Storyful. And finally, Amarasingam, who is an assistant professor in the School of Religion and is cross-appointed to the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. He's also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, an associate fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, and an associate fellow at the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. He's interested in terrorism, radicalization and extremism, diaspora politics, post-war reconstruction, and the sociology of religion. He's been interviewed on CNN, PBS NewsHour, CBC, BBC, and a variety of other outlets. I'm going to hand over to them for some opening remarks. We'll then have a discussion amongst ourselves for about 10 minutes or so, and finally take questions from you, the audience, which should take us to just about 40 minutes. If you do have a question, please post it using the chat function and mention, if you're comfortable doing so, your company and your job. And I'll then fill them to the panelists so we don't have to go through the all too familiar pains of people muting and unmuting themselves. As Suki says, please feel also free to tweet using hashtag COGX 2021. And finally, in the interest of transparency, I should add that today's session is being recorded and you will be able to find the link on the website afterwards. I'm now going to hand over to each panelist from some intro remarks. And Mike, if I could start with you. Conspiracy theories, of course, have surged in popularity during Donald Trump's presidency and more recently during the pandemic. Could you talk us through a little bit what's enabled the recent rise in conspiracy theories and disinformation more broadly?
Sure. Thanks, Zoe. And thanks, my fellow panelists and Suki and everybody who's listening. It's a very interesting question. You use the words fringes of society in your introduction. And actually, that's arguable in a way. If you look at JFK conspiracies, they've been around for a long time. A large proportion of Americans have believed in one or more conspiracy theories about the CIA or JFK. The polling evidence that we have around QAnon varies, and it varies depending on what question you ask. So there's quite a bit of debate about actually sort of how popular these are, whether they're getting more popular or not. But clearly, I'm not an academic or a pollster. I'm a journalist, and I deal in events. And clearly, we have seen the effects of these really come to the fore. And that's really you know, where the rubber hits the road. Why? Well, there's a variety of reasons. Obviously, the U.S. presidential election, combined with the COVID pandemic and a whole sort of series of COVID conspiracy theories that we've been covering and looking into. Also, the backdrop we have here, social media, the ability of these things to sort of spread faster and farther than ever before. And in the last decade or two, there's been a phenomenal amount of not only disinformation operations by states and actors, but a social movement where there's an increasing distrust of institutions, of the so-called mainstream media, right? But, you know, despite all that, there is something going on here. There is definitely something that is on the rise, or having more real world effect. We don't need to sort of just sort of stick our fingers in the air and sort of see which way the wind blows. I want to give you an anecdote, though. In the summer of 2019, I went to a QAnon rally in Scranton, Pennsylvania, famous for being the hometown of Joe Biden. And it was pretty pathetic, if I'm honest. It was a half-empty ballroom. It was maybe 100 people. Now, some of the speakers there later amassed hundreds of thousands of social media followers. One of the organizers was the Republican nominee for Senate in Delaware last year. In 18 months' time, this went from, like you say, a fringe phenomenon to something that was really at the heart of a major mainstream political party, the most powerful country in the world. So something big is happening and continues to happen.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. That's fascinating. As you say, well, the example you mentioned of the QAnon conference, you know, relatively poorly attended, with several of the speakers going on to kind of social media fame. So evidencing really that meteoric rise in conspiracy theories. But also noting what you say about the debate on how popular these really are, and regardless of how popular they are, the very real kind of consequences for all of us. I'd now like to come to Aoife and ask you how these networks are practically growing, and what your investigative work has uncovered on this online ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe, and happy to be here as well. Yeah, so I mean, QAnon is unique for a number of reasons. It's been around for just under 4 years, and it's gone through a number of different iterations. It started on 4chan, which is an anonymous image board kind of associated with neo-Nazi movements and white supremacy movements. It very swiftly moved to 8chan, which is essentially 4chan's evil younger brother. And the people that were involved in kind of making this bubble up on these kind of image boards made a concerted effort then to try and move it to the mainstream. And they did this in a number of ways. They did this by setting up communities on Reddit. So they set up a number of subreddits at the end of 2017. They reached out to a number of YouTubers who then built up an audience, kind of live streaming, you know, decoding these Q drops. So kind of throughout 2018, this is kind of how they built up their audience like this. And it built it up pretty swiftly. These subreddits had tens of thousands really of subscribers after a number of months. And then I suppose midway through 2018 was the first time that the kind of ban hammer came down on QAnon, and Reddit actually banned it, banned a number of the subreddits because they were, you know, inciting violence. They were doxing people, sharing their personal information. And then I suppose after that, Facebook really became the home of the community, and Facebook groups were really where it flourished. And throughout then, you know, 2019, the start of 2020, we found that the movement was increasing across these mainstream platforms, but it was still probably considered somewhat fringe. And kind of, you know, as Mike was saying, the real moment then that it came into the mainstream was when the pandemic struck. And, you know, a research project that we did last year looked at the increase in both QAnon conversations and the increase in membership of Facebook groups, and the increase that we saw in the middle of March last year that coincided with the lockdowns around the world was pretty drastic, to be honest. And there's a number of reasons for this. You know, people were obviously spending more time online during lockdowns, and, you know, the proliferation of various COVID conspiracies in different kind of communities online as well, in anti-vax communities and anti-5G communities. This all, and of course in QAnon communities. So this all kind of made the algorithms push QAnon content into people's news feeds. So it's not necessarily that people were going seeking out QAnon content. It was more that it was landing into their feeds. And then, you know, the next iteration then was probably in the summer of 2020 when the platform started cracking down somewhat on QAnon. And they did this by kind of, you know, banning certain hashtags or demoting certain hashtags. And the QAnon response to this was to co-opt the Save the Children hashtag, which was and still is, you know, a legitimate anti-child trafficking organization. And by co-opting this hashtag, they were able to dilute down QAnon content to kind of eliminate a lot of the kind of more political elements of it and focus instead on advocating for saving children from child trafficking. And they kind of created a moral panic around child trafficking. And this is where we saw QAnon kind of move into the kind of Instagram, you know, the wellness spaces and spirituality spaces on platforms like Instagram. So, you know, and this was really kind of in the middle of 2020 when we saw it, you know, absolutely explode and go from a fringe movement to a more mainstream movement. And then I suppose, you know, the next iteration then was in about October of 2020 when the likes of Facebook, you know, removed all QAnon groups and pages from their platform. YouTube removed, you know, hundreds of accounts. Twitter followed suit then as well. So that now means that, you know, the actual specific QAnon communities now kind of live on platforms like Telegram. And, you know, to a certain extent, you know, QAnon has changed so much even in those 6 months since October as well. Internationally, QAnon has kind of just become almost a blueprint for conspiratorial thinking. The idea of doing your own research and coming to your own conclusions. This came from QAnon and it's now filtered into the kind of COVID conspiracy, anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine kind of movements as well. And then you have kind of the still kind of specific QAnon communities that are kind of more formed around the influencers that have been kind of pushing this for the last number of years. And a number of them are, you know, Q hasn't posted since December of last year. So a number of them are they're kind of pushing their own narratives at this stage. And some of them are pushing kind of financial scams. Some of them are going, you know, doubling down pretty deep and going into kind of neo-Nazi territory. So there's, you know, there's a lot of kind of different iterations that it's had throughout the years. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about it is how quickly it can change and how quickly it can kind of, you know, change to suit the platform that it's moving to as well.
Thanks, Aoife. That's fascinating, and a lot from what you've said to unpack here. I, you know, note what you say in terms of the rise, of course, during COVID of various conspiracy theories from kind of anti-vax to anti-5G. The really interesting point you make about people not necessarily going to seek out QAnon content, but it just kind of showing up on your feeds. And if you've been exposed to it kind of enough times and enough people have, that kind of ends up catching on. And finally, and we can touch on this later, the future of these communities, especially after Facebook and other tech platforms' action last year, and whether they will kind of outlive these kind of measures. Amarnath, if I could now come to you, and I wanted to ask you how you think we've gone from kind of fringe theory to mainstream threat, and whether conspiracy culture such as QAnon be up there with terrorist and major security threats in government's eyes?
I mean, so the easy answer is no. It's not a threat on the level of some of the other groups that we study, like Al Qaeda or ISIS, or even more organized far right groups like Aoife or the Base. But so that's on the one hand. But I think on the other hand, we've seen several instances. So I guess we could talk about the threat in a few different ways. I think on the one hand, there's the ongoing threat of what has been called kind of lone actor violence, right? And so QAnon in particular has proven itself to be able to mobilize people to violence in ways that other conspiracy theories, at least historically, haven't done, right? So when I used to study the 9/11 truther movement, all those guys really did often was take to the streets. They would hold banners in downtown Toronto or wherever, and then kind of flutter home. Whereas with movements like QAnon, we've seen, Matthew Philip Wright. He drove to Hoover Dam and demanded the release of a government report. Anthony Camello killed a member of the Gambino crime family, and Jessica Prim threatened to kill, Bin Laden. Joe Biden, and a few other speakers mentioned the kind of COVID conspiracies built into a lot of these other theories. So there's the kind of ongoing lone actor violence, I think, and then there's the START Center, the START Terrorism Center, basically released a report a few weeks ago talking about how many QAnon offenders have been arrested, and they've counted 79 QAnon affiliated or QAnon adjacent people who've been arrested and charged with criminal offenses, and that ranges from weapons possessions to felony threats to kidnapping, terrorism threats, and things like that. And so there's a kind of individualized lone actor sense of what's happening. Secondly, I would say the threat is, as Mike mentioned, sometimes greater, because what's happening is in terms of social trust, we know from study after study that people who believe in conspiracy theories, tend not to vaccinate their kids, they tend not to vote, they tend not to volunteer, they tend not to donate. And so it's not simply, kind of beliefs that you hold and then go about your day. They actually have real life impact. They actually impact how you go through the outside world. And so whether you trust media, whether you trust your doctor, and things like that. And so there's a kind of unprecedented collapse in social trust that we're seeing. Probably something we haven't seen for a few decades. And so, that is going to be a kind of long-term threat, I think, just for the very fabric of our society and how we, can have a vibrant public space and a democratic conversation when a solid chunk of people believe that the world is run by satanic pedophiles and they don't believe in election results. And so I think there's a kind of, when we talk about threat, there's a kind of more insidious threat, I think, that's at play as opposed to simply terrorism.
Thank you. And yeah, as you say, QAnon very much, having mobilized people in a way that other conspiracy theories perhaps in the past haven't. But also interesting to note, as you say, the perhaps greater threat in terms of social implications, so in terms of getting your kids vaccinated, of education, of how you go about your daily lives, and of course the trust which you place in the media. Before I go on to a few more questions, I just want to remind the audience and anyone who's joined in the meantime, if you do have a question for the panel, please post it in the chat box. I'll then fill those to our panelists. We have another kind of 15, 20 minutes or so would love to hear from you. I suppose really my next question after this and understanding how these networks grow would be how we mitigate them and temper them. I mean, how do you counter when it is so kind of fast spreading and so omnipresent that type of culture? Does the responsibility lie with the tech platforms? Does it rely with the authorities? And also what do you think has been effective in the past at kind of countering conspiracy theories like QAnon?
Well, I would probably defer to the other members of the panel on this one. We take a specific approach, and that is, we will put out reliable information. We will investigate the sources of these things. I personally have issues with the tech companies that we discuss, but on the other hand, we are an organization that has to remain fairly neutral when it comes to these kinds of things. So it's far from sort of me to sort of advocate any of these, but I'm very interested in if the other panelists have found anything that's actually sort of useful in these sorts of situations. I know there probably won't be a silver bullet, but what do we do?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Like, as you say, there's no magic wand, there's no silver bullet, and it's definitely, there's multiple things really that I think have to be done. Regulating the online platforms in some way is obviously a big conversation that needs to be had. I personally think that, banning communities like in the way that QAnon was banned, it's a double-edged sword in so many ways. I mean, it's true now that you can't really find specific QAnon related groups on Facebook, but what's happened is that QAnon has just spread out, and it's really hard to track QAnon now because it's just become so diluted and it's become part of the wider conspiratorial kind of community. And the other thing that kind of does is it pushes people to platforms that actually have less moderation than the likes of Facebook or YouTube. So you have, QAnon communities that were axed off Facebook, maybe moving to places like Gab. And Gab are, completely unmoderated and absolutely, full with more kind of extremist content than any of the other mainstream platforms. But I think that transparency around the algorithms that are used on these platforms is key really to how we're going to figure this out, because at the moment no one really knows how they work, and the platforms are kind of not, they're not willing to kind of give that information to researchers to figure it out. So regulating and transparency around that is one thing, and the other thing that I'd be fairly passionate about is media literacy and introducing media literacy classes in schools and online literacy classes. I think that in a lot of ways that we haven't really reckoned with the way that we consume information has just completely changed in a very, very short space of time. And there really needs to be kind of a reaction to that in an educational sense as well.
That's a really good point. And I completely echo, Mike's earlier point in terms of the role of the media not being, of course, to advocate for kind of any one thing, but at the same time, I believe there's never been a kind of greater need for unbiased, kind of accurate and well-sourced information. Amarnath, where do you see part of the solution being? Do you think it also is a combination of media literacy, transparency from the kind of tech and AI platforms?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think from my experience from 2013, 2014, dealing with groups like ISIS, we had the exact same debates back, 6 years ago. It was a bit of an easier policy conversation because I don't think there are many who disagree with taking a beheading video off of Twitter, right? And so the policy conversation was quite different. But I think the same background debates are the same in terms of deplatforming generally does work in getting people out of kind of mainstream conversations, and that's a conversation we need to have about what we want our public sphere to look like, particularly our online public sphere to look like. Taking them off, we saw a massive migration for both ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and with QAnon to basically Telegram, Gab, and these other smaller platforms. And on the other hand, I think there's, as Aoife mentioned, I think there's a broader literacy conversation to be had, and this is very upstream, to actually help people deal with the rapid changes in media and social media that we're seeing, that many people aren't really able to navigate what these platforms are about, what kind of information they're being fed, whether they can spot disinformation, misinformation, troll accounts. I've seen people online arguing with what are obviously bot accounts, right? And so I think there's at base a literacy question to be had as well, in terms of, can we train people to actually navigate the rapid changes that we've seen in the online space? And finally, I would say in terms of the offline interventions, those have proven to be a bit difficult, right? Because I think we know from research that once people are in the thick of these movements, whatever they might be, trying to get them out is next to impossible, right? So they have to eventually make a decision to actually step outside of that bubble, for a lack of a better term, before any of the resources that we've placed can actually be effective. And so it's important to have those resources in place, intervention programs, training family members to talk to people who've gone down these rabbit holes, make sure they know what to say, how to say it, as opposed to just making fun of them online, that sort of thing. But a lot of those initiatives don't really have an impact until the person is kind of ready to leave and ready to hear those kinds of messages. And so I would say have those resources in place, but recognize that they might not be immediately effective in the way that you think they might be.
Picking up on that, I have to say that is one thing that is just a massive gap that is going to be a big thing. There's, QAnon and COVID conspiracies, and, there's a little bit of overlap there. We're just seeing hundreds, thousands of people get involved in this. There's going to be a reckoning. And I don't necessarily see that there is a systematic sort of way of, let me put it this way. There's nothing like Al-Anon, for the relatives of alcoholics in the conspiracy world. It seems a big gap to me.
Yeah, and touching, actually, this reminds me of the point perhaps, Aoife, you were earlier making on, the platforms that these groups kind of migrate to. A question we have here from Sina Williams asks, how do we deal with the kind of whack-a-mole situation where, these groups and conspiracy theories tend to migrate from one platform to the next, especially those who then move to places like Telegram or highly encrypted places like the dark web? And does this not pose issues in terms of dealing with them from a both counterterrorism and national security perspective?
I can jump in. I think there's this assumption about Telegram that it's some nefarious, kind of underground platform. It's really not. I mean, it's used by millions of people around the world. It just also happens to be used by some more seedy characters. And so we saw jihadist groups make a mass migration in 2015, followed soon after by a lot of far-right groups. And then QAnon QAnon influencers kind of moved in as well. The thing I'll say about Telegram, and we saw some of this happening in real time when the QAnon migrated, was there was a real interest on the part of more hardcore far-right groups to see, oh, can we kind of rope in a lot of these disaffected Trump supporters who are now, mad at social media platforms and mad at the election results, and can we kind of get them into more hardcore movements? As far as I can tell, that didn't happen too much. But there was also, what I was worried about is a lot of these kind of run-of-the-mill MAGA supporters were going to be in for a rude awakening when they landed in Telegram, because Telegram is not a fun place, right? It's crazy anti-Semitic, crazy Islamophobic, violent. There's bomb-making materials on there. There's all sorts of information that you wouldn't necessarily see on Telegram, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And so when a lot of these, 65-year-old grandmas with Q T-shirts show up on Telegram, it wasn't going to be a fun experience for them. And so I was never too big on seeing Telegram as, oh, this is going to be the new home for QAnon. Even though it's kind of become that way for some supporters, but I do think there's been a bit of a drop-off. The other thing I'll add is I think, going back to your earlier question, we should probably recognize the kind of importance of the moment, right, in the popularity of QAnon. I mean, it was a kind of unprecedented perfect storm of factors, from COVID conspiracy theories to the Trump administration, which allowed this sort of mainstreaming to occur. And so I don't know how easily those perfect storm of factors can be replicated going forward for other movements that would place QAnon at the same level of, place other movements at the same level of the threat. So that's maybe an optimistic thing to look at as well in terms of going, future movements along these lines.
That's a very good point, and we can come back to the future of these movements in a second. But for now, I want to take another question from the audience that perhaps might be best for you, coming from the BBC, which is, online platforms are now increasingly using prompts about kind of text, false information. Do you think these are and can be effective in terms of reducing the effects of QAnon and other related claims?
I wish we knew. The social media companies say that they are, but the difficulty is that people are quick learners, and they quickly find ways around getting their information labeled in such a way. They know how to sort of step right up to the line and not cross the line to avoid a label or a ban or a temporary restriction of the account. So, on the other hand, there is, there's evidence that sort of deplatforming type things do sort of reduce the spread of certain messages, or perhaps certain characters who are spreading certain messages. But I have a healthy skepticism, I think, about the actual sort of ability of that stuff to have a really big impact.
And Aoife, perhaps coming back to you, going back to just the way these kind of communities proliferate online, how much, if any, interaction or conversation is it between them? Do they kind of tend to grow and proliferate very much in isolation from one another? Or are we seeing kind of more of a concerted push to share theories, impact, and what have you?
I suppose, if you're talking kind of presently, I do think that Telegram really is the home where the likes of QAnon and things like that and those kind of communities where they have found their new community. And there is, I think, a few years ago, there was definitely more of a concerted effort to kind of spread their messaging to a wider audience. And now they're kind of more in their own bubble, I suppose. But, and then if you're talking about the kind of COVID conspiracy, that's more of a, there is definitely more of a concerted effort there to kind of spread their messaging wider. And you even see this, there's been a massive effort, internationally, I can imagine, but it's definitely happening here and in the UK, there's now like Telegram channels that have been set up for people to print stickers that they can, you know, go and put on the lampposts on their streets. So it's almost like this effort to move from like online kind of activism to offline activism, and to try and get their messaging from the online platforms in like onto the streets, and for people to see it that maybe wouldn't be on these platforms. So I suppose there's kind of a bit of both going on there. It just depends on the community you're looking at.
We're really focused on that sort of idea that there is this culture that is building. It's something that is not necessarily new, but in the UK in particular, there's a long sort of, you know, alternative culture, you know, alternative medicine, you know, Glastonbury and hippies and all this other stuff. And that some of the energy there is being drawn into this COVID conspiracy stuff. Weirdly, you know, some of the far right elements too are coming here, and there's it's a sort of a growing, burgeoning movement. It's very interesting how big it will get and what form it will take in the future.
And so talking about going back to, you know, the future of these movements, do you think that looking even at COVID, that as, you know, vaccination efforts kind of ramp up, lockdowns end, that we might see some of these theories kind of dying down? And if so, what's next? I mean, you know, in most people's minds, or the general public, QAnon would be the most famous of these. Do you think we're going to see another kind of major movement, or is the future of these theories to be very kind of smaller and isolated ones, depending on where people are based?
I mean, I think there are different kinds of conspiracy theories, right? And so I think it's important to recognize how some of them you can deal with, some of them are kind of naturally will deflate. And I think COVID conspiracies are a good example, as tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people get vaccinated, and the kind of pandemic disappears, people kind of move on with their lives, the kind of sense of normalcy sets in, people see their families getting vaccinated and nothing happens to them, they don't turn magnetic. I think it'll have an impact in terms of the COVID kind of vaccine conspiracies. So those are kind of provable, right? Whereas QAnon is not. So I think that those QAnon in particular has kind of built into it a kind of survival mechanism. I mean, it started on a failure of prophecy, right? The whole movement started on this idea that Hillary Clinton was going to be arrested in a few days. It didn't happen. The movement gets born out of a failure of prophecy, and it survived a whole host of these kinds of failures and predictions that have you know, come about over the last couple of years. And so I think there's a kind of survival mechanism built into the ideology itself, which basically means it'll be around for a while. It's also, secondly, as Travis View and others have noted, has a bizarre ability to latch onto ongoing other movements. It could be far right, it could be kind of these new agey movements that are happening, and so it's not necessarily a group, but it's kind of an aesthetic that can also color other movements that are happening, and make them more conspiratorial, right? And so I think the future of something like QAnon isn't going to be, oh, it's a kind of isolated movement that survives on its own, but it'll kind of just be part of the ecosystem of other ideas that are floating around, which in some ways can be more dangerous.
And then one perhaps more, I mean, this is perhaps an unfair level of responsibility to put, you know, on the shoulders of the general public, but for, you know, your average Joe who may not be well versed into kind of conspiracy theories, nor particularly tech savvy, what can they take as kind of day-to-day steps to just, you know, guard against this type of misinformation, or at least if they do receive it, kind of receive it critically and be able to question it? Or does that responsibility, you think, lie mostly with the tech platforms and the media? Perhaps Mike or Aoife?
Well, no, I think that, you know, developing a healthy level of skepticism about, you know, everything that you read online, but making sure that, you know, developing the kind of very basic skills to check the sources of what you're reading is, I think, a pretty easy thing that most people can do. If you read something on your Facebook feed and you don't know where it comes from, a quick Google may tell you where it comes from. And so I would say that, you know, checking your sources like that is definitely one of the top things to do. If you want to figure out what's happening in the world, you have to get your information from the news and from the news media. And that's not to say that the media is perfect and that, you know, it's always right. You know, the media is run by humans, and humans you know, make mistakes all the time. But at the end of the day, you know, you're going to get more reliable information from, you know, various media sources around the world than from completely unsourced information that you're coming across in your Facebook feed.
That's a good point. Anything you'd add as a journalist?
Yeah, just to, I mean, to add to that, I would say that it's really important, I think, for people to actually develop their systems of empathy and how to deal with these things. It's pretty likely that you're going to encounter some of these people now or in the future, right? You're pretty lucky if you don't. Now, as an American who has family members who lived in slightly alternative reality in under the Trump presidency, I kind of have a little bit of experience of this. So maybe I'm a little bit ahead of the game when it comes to this, but we're really quite interested in how you can talk to that crazy uncle or talk to that friend who's been sort of drawn into this stuff with empathy, without sort of mocking them, with sort of nudging them to facts, and by being patient. It's something that a lot of us are going to have to develop over the next few years, these kinds of skills.
That's a really good point. I think, you know, learning to not necessarily kind of, well, basically recognize the reality of kind of living with these networks, and that you are in your day-to-day life, whether it's as a journalist or as a researcher or just kind of a citizen, encounter these people and this type of misinformation. So being equipped with the kind of tools to recognize it. We're having a few more questions coming in from the audience, but are sadly kind of running to the end of our time. So I'm going to wrap up here. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure we could go on for hours, but I'm conscious of your time and also of our audience's time.